The year was 1943, and deep in the frozen wasteland of the Eastern Front, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Soviet ace pilot Captain Viktor Kozlov had just received the most unusual assignment of his career, to test fly a machine that would change everything he thought he knew about aerial combat. What he discovered in that American-built cockpit would shake the very foundations of Soviet aviation doctrine and force him to confront a truth that his commanders desperately wanted to keep buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter wind howled across the makeshift airfield at Stalingrad, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning fuel and twisted metal. Captain Viktor Kozlov pulled his flight jacket tighter as he approached the aircraft that had been shrouded in mystery for weeks. Soviet ground crews had been working around the clock, speaking in hushed tones about the special delivery that had arrived under the cover of darkness. Viktor had earned his reputation the hard way, downing 17 German aircraft in brutal dogfights over the Volga. His Yak-1 had become an extension of his own body, every control surface responding to his slightest touch. But today, he wasn't climbing into his familiar cockpit. Today, he would fly something that officially didn't exist. The aircraft before him was sleek and predatory, its aluminum skin gleaming despite the harsh conditions. Unlike the rugged utilitarian design of Soviet fighters, this machine spoke of precision engineering and abundant resources. Every rivet was perfectly placed, every panel fitted with machine-like accuracy that Soviet factories, despite their heroic efforts, simply couldn't match. "American P-51 Mustang," muttered Senior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov, Viktor's wingman and closest friend. "They say it can outrun anything the Germans have." Viktor ran his hand along the aircraft's wing, feeling the smooth metal beneath his gloves. The construction quality was undeniable. Where Soviet aircraft showed the marks of rapid wartime production, slight irregularities, hand-fitted components, the telltale signs of a nation pouring everything into survival, this Mustang exhibited a level of manufacturing sophistication that seemed almost luxurious. Colonel Ivan Volkov emerged from the command bunker, his weathered face bearing the stern expression that had become his trademark. A veteran of the Spanish Civil War and countless battles since, Volkov commanded absolute respect from every pilot under his command. But today, something different flickered in his gray eyes: uncertainty, perhaps even concern. "Kozlov," the colonel barked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You'll take her up for initial evaluation. Standard flight characteristics, weapon systems, everything. We need to know what we're dealing with." The briefing had been unusually sparse. Normally, Volkov would provide detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities, tactical considerations, and specific mission parameters. This time, he'd simply handed Viktor a flight manual, written in English, hastily translated by someone whose technical knowledge clearly exceeded their linguistic skills. Viktor climbed into the cockpit, immediately noticing the differences. The instrument panel was a marvel of clarity and organization. Where Soviet fighters packed essential gauges into available space with little regard for ergonomics, the Mustang's layout seemed designed by someone who actually flew combat missions. Every switch, every dial had been positioned for maximum accessibility during the chaos of aerial combat. The engine fired with a smooth rumble that sent vibrations through the airframe in a distinctly different pattern than Soviet power plants. American engineering had produced something that ran with mechanical precision, every cylinder firing in perfect sequence. Viktor had grown accustomed to the temperamental nature of Soviet engines, machines that required constant attention and adjustment. This Merlin engine seemed content to simply work reliably and efficiently.
As Victor taxied toward the runway, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Orlov, the squadron's technical officer, jogged alongside the aircraft. Orlov had spent the previous week poring over technical specifications, comparing American and Soviet approaches to fighter design. His findings had been disturbing enough to warrant a closed-door meeting with Colonel Volkov. The fuel injection system alone, Orlov had explained during that meeting, represents a level of precision manufacturing that we're at least 2 years away from achieving. Their tolerances are measured in fractions that our current machinery simply can't replicate consistently. Volkov had listened in silence, understanding the implications. If American industry could produce such sophisticated aircraft while simultaneously supplying weapons to multiple allies across several theaters of war, what did that say about their true manufacturing capacity? Victor advanced the throttle, feeling the Mustang respond with eager acceleration. The aircraft lifted off with an ease that surprised him, climbing at an angle that his Yak-1 could never match while fully loaded. At altitude, he began a series of standard maneuvers, testing the aircraft's handling characteristics against his extensive combat experience. The Mustang rolled faster than any fighter he'd flown. Its controls remained responsive even at high speeds, where Soviet aircraft became sluggish and unpredictable. During a simulated diving attack, Victor pulled negative Gs without experiencing the engine cutting out, a chronic problem with Soviet fighters that had cost many pilots their lives when German aircraft capitalized on predictable engine failures. More impressive still was the aircraft's range. Soviet fighters were notorious for their limited endurance, forcing pilots to hover fuel carefully and plan missions around available range. The Mustang carried enough fuel for extended operations, giving pilots the luxury of staying in combat longer or flying deeper into enemy territory without the constant anxiety of fuel starvation. The radio crackled as Victor reported his initial observations to ground control. "Control, this aircraft exhibits exceptional performance characteristics across all flight regimes. Handling remains predictable at high speeds, engine performance is consistent throughout the power range, and fuel consumption appears remarkably efficient."
Colonel Volkov's voice came through the static. "Continue evaluation. Test weapons systems." Victor armed the aircraft's machine guns, noting the substantial ammunition capacity compared to Soviet fighters. When he triggered a burst at a ground target, the weapons fired with mechanical precision, each gun cycling smoothly without the jamming issues that plagued many Soviet installations. The harmonization was perfect, all rounds converging exactly where the gun sight indicated. During the flight, Victor found himself comparing every aspect of the Mustang to his beloved Yak-1. While the Soviet fighter was rugged and could absorb tremendous damage, the American aircraft seemed designed to avoid taking hits altogether. Its speed and climbing ability meant that engagements could be fought on the pilot's terms rather than being forced into desperate defensive maneuvers. The implications were staggering. If America could produce such sophisticated aircraft in quantities sufficient to supply allies while maintaining their own massive air forces, their industrial capacity dwarfed anything the Soviet Union could achieve in the foreseeable future. This wasn't just about better engineering. It represented a fundamental difference in manufacturing philosophy and capability. As Victor brought the Mustang in for landing, he noticed ground crew members watching intently. These men had serviced hundreds of Soviet aircraft, understanding intimately the compromises and limitations of their own machines. Seeing American engineering firsthand was forcing uncomfortable comparisons that went far beyond simple technical specifications. The aircraft touched down with smooth precision, its landing gear absorbing the impact with hydraulic efficiency that Soviet systems rarely achieved. As Victor taxied back to the parking area, he could see Colonel Volkov waiting with his arms crossed, ready for a detailed debrief that would undoubtedly have consequences far beyond this single test flight. Winter was approaching when Captain Viktor Kozlov received the most classified assignment of the war. A sealed envelope bearing multiple security stamps arrived at his quarters at 4 o'clock hours, delivered by a courier who departed immediately without speaking. Inside, orders signed by Marshal Alexander Novikov himself directed Viktor to report to a facility that officially didn't exist. The journey took 3 days by train across the frozen steppes of Western Russia, ending at a railway siding surrounded by nothing but snow-covered forest. A single truck waited, its driver wearing the uniform of state security rather than regular army. They drove for 2 hours along unmarked roads until reaching a compound hidden beneath camouflage netting so sophisticated it was invisible from 50 meters away. What Viktor discovered there would haunt him for decades. The facility housed captured German pilots, American technical advisors, and Soviet engineers working together in an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Project Thunder, its codename revealed only after Viktor signed documents that carried penalties including execution for disclosure, represented the Soviet Union's most ambitious attempt to reverse engineer American aviation technology. Dr. Yevgeny Fedorov, the project's chief engineer, was a thin man whose hands shook constantly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. He had spent 6 months dissecting American aircraft with the precision of a surgeon, cataloging every component, every material, every manufacturing technique that differed from Soviet practices. The metallurgia alone, Fedorov explained, while leading Viktor through workshops filled with disassembled aircraft, represents advances we hadn't anticipated achieving until 1950. Their aluminium alloys demonstrate strength-to-weight ratios that our current furnaces simply cannot reproduce. Viktor examined engine components laid out on examination tables, like organs during an autopsy. Each part bore measurements, stress analysis results, and compatibility notes scrawled in margins by desperate engineers trying to understand manufacturing processes that seemed almost magical in their precision. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, an American technical liaison, observed the proceedings with professional detachment. Morrison had arrived 3 weeks earlier as part of a classified exchange program that existed in the gray zones between official diplomacy and military necessity. His presence created uncomfortable dynamics for Soviet personnel unused to foreign observers. "Your pilots are adapting remarkably well to our aircraft," Morrison commented during a briefing session, "but I'm curious about your long-term production intentions." The question hung in the air like smoke from a burned-out tank. Soviet engineers exchanged glances that communicated volumes about classified discussions Morrison wasn't privy to. Everyone understood that reverse engineering American technology was just the beginning of a much larger strategic initiative. Captain Thomas Anderson, a captured German pilot who had extensive experience fighting American aircraft over Western Europe, Anderson had been shot down by American P-51s during the Normandy campaign and possessed detailed knowledge of how American pilots utilized their aircraft's capabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "They fight differently than you Soviets," Anderson explained through an interpreter during an interrogation session. "Where you rely on numbers and coordinated attacks, Americans use individual aircraft performance to dominate specific airspace. Their pilots are trained to exploit speed and altitude advantages that your current fighters cannot match." This revelation troubled Soviet tactical planners who had developed doctrine around aircraft limitations rather than capabilities. American fighting techniques assumed performance characteristics that Soviet aircraft simply didn't possess, creating a fundamental mismatch between available equipment and optimal tactics. The implications extended beyond individual combat encounters. American pilots could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, maintain air superiority over broader geographic areas, and sustain combat operations for longer periods than Soviet aircraft allowed. These advantages translated into strategic capabilities that affected entire campaign outcomes. Over the following weeks, Victor participated in extensive flight testing designed to push American aircraft beyond normal operational limits. Soviet test pilots needed to understand not just nominal performance specifications, but also failure modes, emergency procedures, and maintenance requirements under combat conditions. During one particularly revealing test flight, Victor intentionally overstressed a P-51's airframe to determine structural limits. The aircraft withstood G-forces that would have destroyed most Soviet fighters, demonstrating safety margins that reflected abundance of materials and conservative engineering practices. Soviet aircraft, built under resource constraints, operated much closer to their absolute structural limits. "We build aircraft to survive," Victor reported during his debrief. "They build aircraft to dominate." The psychological impact on Soviet engineers was profound. Men who had spent years developing ingenious solutions to material shortages and manufacturing limitations suddenly confronted evidence of what unlimited resources and advanced technology could achieve. The American approach wasn't necessarily superior engineering, it was simply engineering unconstrained by the limitations that defined Soviet aviation development. Dr. Fedorov's team identified dozens of specific improvements that could be incorporated into future Soviet aircraft designs. Advanced fuel injection systems, sophisticated hydraulics, precision-manufactured components, each element represented potential performance gains that could close the capability gap with American fighters. However, implementing these improvements required manufacturing capabilities that Soviet industry couldn't achieve quickly. The precision tooling, quality control processes, and metallurgical techniques necessary to reproduce American performance standards would take years to develop, even with captured examples to study. Meanwhile, intelligence reports indicated that American aircraft production was accelerating rather than leveling off. New variants appeared monthly, each incorporating improvements that kept American aviation technology ahead of Soviet reverse engineering efforts. It was becoming clear that copying existing designs wouldn't be sufficient to achieve parity. The strategic implications were staggering. If America could maintain technological leadership in aviation while simultaneously outproducing Soviet factories by massive margins, post-war air power dynamics would heavily favor American interests. Soviet planners began considering scenarios where American air superiority could threaten Soviet territorial security. Colonel Morrison requested a meeting with Victor to discuss operational experiences with American aircraft. The conversation, conducted in heavily accented English with frequent translation breaks, revealed American interest in Soviet pilot techniques and tactical innovations. "Your pilots demonstrate remarkable adaptability," Morrison observed. "American pilots train extensively in standardized procedures, but Soviet pilots seem more capable of improvisation under unexpected circumstances." Victor realized this was more than casual conversation. Morrison was conducting his own intelligence assessment, evaluating Soviet pilot capabilities and tactical doctrine for purposes that weren't entirely friendly. The exchange of information worked both directions, and Americans were learning as much about Soviet aviation as Soviets were discovering about American technology. The most disturbing revelation came during Victor's final week at the facility. Dr. Fedorov shared classified intelligence about American production planning that extended far beyond wartime requirements. American factories were being designed for post-war expansion rather than conversion to civilian production, suggesting long-term military preparation that assumed continued international tensions. "They're not planning for peace," Fedorov said quietly during a late-night discussion. "They're planning for the next war." As Victor prepared to return to combat operations, he carried with him knowledge that would influence Soviet aviation development for decades. The American aircraft weren't just superior weapons, they represented a fundamental challenge to Soviet technological sovereignty that would require massive industrial and educational investments to address. The war might be ending, but Victor understood that a new kind of conflict was beginning, one fought with manufacturing capacity and technological innovation rather than traditional military force. The spring of 1944 brought unexpected orders that would test everything Viktor Kozlov had learned about American aviation technology. Marshal Stalin himself had approved Operation Red Eagle, a classified mission that would see Soviet pilots flying American aircraft deep into German-occupied territory for purposes that went far beyond conventional combat operations.
Victor found himself at an airfield near Smolensk, surrounded by pilots he'd never met but whose reputations preceded them. Major Pavel Dmitriev, the legendary ace from the Battle of Stalingrad with 23 confirmed kills. Captain Mikhail Volkov, a former test pilot who had evaluated captured German aircraft throughout the war. Lieutenant Konstantin Petrov, barely 22 years old, but already displaying the cold precision that marked the war's most dangerous pilots. Their mission briefing came from General Alexei Antonov, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, whose presence indicated the operation's strategic importance. The target was a German research facility in occupied Poland, where intelligence suggested the Luftwaffe was developing jet-powered interceptors that could potentially neutralize Allied bomber offensives. "You will fly American P-51 Mustangs stripped of all Soviet markings," Antonov explained while pointing to reconnaissance photographs spread across a map table. "If captured, you are American pilots conducting deep reconnaissance. Your cover identities have been prepared accordingly." The implications were staggering. Soviet pilots would masquerade as Americans, flying American aircraft on a mission that could ignite diplomatic crises if discovered. The operation required not just flying skills, but the ability to convincingly portray American aviators under interrogation. Captain Jack Sullivan, an actual American pilot attached to the mission as an advisor, spent 3 days coaching the Soviet pilots in American flight procedures, radio protocols, and cultural details that could mean the difference between successful deception and catastrophic exposure. "American pilots talk differently on the radio," Sullivan explained during training sessions. "Less formal than your military communications. More individual personality comes through, even during combat operations." Victor practiced American slang, studied photographs of American cities he'd supposedly grown up in, and memorized personal details about a fictional life in Ohio. The deception extended beyond simple impersonation. He had to think like an American pilot, react like one, even bleed like one if the mission went wrong. The modified Mustangs carried additional fuel tanks and specialized reconnaissance cameras capable of photographing German facilities from altitudes that conventional Soviet aircraft couldn't reach. More importantly, they carried electronic equipment designed to intercept German radar and communication signals, technology that existed nowhere in the Soviet inventory.
On the morning of the mission, Victor climbed into a cockpit that bore American star insignia and carried forged identification documents that listed him as Lieutenant William Thompson from Cleveland, Ohio. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using American technology to gather intelligence that would ultimately serve Soviet strategic interests. The flight deep into German territory revealed the true capabilities of American long-range fighters. Where Soviet missions required careful fuel management and limited operational radius, the Mustangs provided endurance that allowed extensive reconnaissance without the constant anxiety of fuel exhaustion. At 25,000 feet over occupied Poland, Victor photographed German airfields that showed activities suggesting advanced aircraft development. Strange aircraft shapes under camouflage covers, unusual runway configurations designed for high-speed operations, and facility layouts that differed markedly from conventional fighter bases. The return flight nearly ended in disaster when German radar detected the formation and vectored interceptors to attack. The ensuing aerial battle lasted 40 minutes and demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of flying American aircraft while maintaining operational deception. Victor found himself in a dogfight with a German Focke-Wulf 190, but had to fight using American tactical doctrine rather than Soviet techniques he'd mastered over 2 years of combat. American pilots favored high-speed passes and energy management rather than the turning fights that characterized Eastern Front aerial combat. Maintain altitude advantage, Sullivan had instructed during training. American pilots use speed and diving attacks rather than sustained turning engagements. The difference in approach proved crucial when Victor's wingman, Major Dmitriev, instinctively attempted a tight turning fight with a German Messerschmitt. The maneuver was tactically sound for Soviet operations, but completely inconsistent with American doctrine. Victor had to break radio silence to redirect Dmitriev using American terminology and procedures. "Blue 3, extend and climb," Victor transmitted, using the call sign system that American pilots employed. "Don't turn with him." The successful completion of Operation Red Eagle provided Soviet intelligence with detailed information about German jet aircraft, but also revealed uncomfortable truths about American technological integration. The electronic systems that allowed precise navigation and target identification represented advances in miniaturization and reliability that Soviet industry couldn't reproduce. On the morning of the mission, Victor climbed into a cockpit that bore American star insignia and carried forged identification documents that listed him as Lieutenant William Thompson from Cleveland, Ohio. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using American technology to gather intelligence that would ultimately serve Soviet strategic interests. The flight deep into German territory revealed the true capabilities of American long-range fighters. Where Soviet missions required careful fuel management and limited operational radius, the Mustangs provided endurance that allowed extensive reconnaissance without the constant anxiety of fuel exhaustion. At 25,000 feet over occupied Poland, Victor photographed German airfields that showed activities suggesting advanced aircraft development. Strange aircraft shapes under camouflage covers, unusual runway configurations designed for high-speed operations, and facility layouts that differed markedly from conventional fighter bases. The return flight nearly ended in disaster when German radar detected the formation and vectored interceptors to attack. The ensuing aerial battle lasted 40 minutes and demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of flying American aircraft while maintaining operational deception.
Victor found himself in a dogfight with a German Focke-Wulf 190, but had to fight using American tactical doctrine rather than Soviet techniques he'd mastered over 2 years of combat. American pilots favored high-speed passes and energy management rather than the turning fights that characterized Eastern Front aerial combat. Maintain altitude advantage, Sullivan had instructed during training. American pilots use speed and diving attacks rather than sustained turning engagements. The difference in approach proved crucial when Victor's wingman, Major Dmitriev, instinctively attempted a tight turning fight with a German Messerschmitt. The maneuver was tactically sound for Soviet operations, but completely inconsistent with American doctrine. Victor had to break radio silence to redirect Dmitriev using American terminology and procedures. "Blue 3, extend and climb," Victor transmitted, using the call sign system that American pilots employed. "Don't turn with him." The successful completion of Operation Red Eagle provided Soviet intelligence with detailed information about German jet aircraft, but also revealed uncomfortable truths about American technological integration. The electronic systems that allowed precise navigation and target identification represented advances in miniaturization and reliability that Soviet industry couldn't reproduce.
They know exactly how their aircraft perform under every possible condition, reported Chief Engineer Fedorov during the technical assessment. "We estimate performance based on theoretical calculations and limited testing. They measure it continuously during actual operations." This data-driven approach to aviation represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy. American forces gathered information, analyzed it systematically, and made decisions based on quantitative assessment rather than intuition and experience alone. The implications extended far beyond individual aircraft performance. If Americans could optimize every aspect of aviation operations through systematic data collection and analysis, their military effectiveness would compound over time as they accumulated operational experience and refined their procedures accordingly. Victor's final report to General Antonov included observations that would influence Soviet aviation development for decades. American technology wasn't just superior in individual components, it represented an integrated approach to air warfare that maximized the effectiveness of every element through systematic optimization and continuous improvement. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Victor understood that Soviet aviation faced challenges that extended far beyond catching up with current American capabilities. The real threat was American industrial and technological momentum that could maintain superiority through continuous innovation and systematic improvement. The success of Operation Red Eagle had demonstrated Soviet pilots' ability to master American equipment and procedures, but it had also revealed the enormous gap between Soviet and American approaches to military aviation that would define post-war strategic competition. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over, but for Captain Viktor Kozlov, the real conflict was just beginning. As Victor celebrations erupted across the Soviet Union, Victor received orders that would determine his fate for the next 4 decades. He was to report to Marshal Ivan Konev personally, a summons that could mean either the highest honors or immediate arrest. The meeting took place in a requisitioned German mansion outside Berlin, its ornate rooms now serving as temporary headquarters for the Soviet occupation forces. Konev, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, sat behind a mahogany desk that had once belonged to a Nazi general, studying a file that bore Victor's photograph and service record. "Captain Kozlov," Konev began without preamble, "your experiences with American aircraft have made you valuable to the motherland in ways you cannot yet comprehend." The Marshal opened a leather portfolio containing photographs that made Victor's blood run cold. Images of American B-29 superfortresses flying over Japanese cities. Technical drawings of jet engines more advanced than anything Germany had developed. Most disturbing of all, reconnaissance photographs of American bomber bases being constructed in England, their runways oriented toward the east. The Americans possess capabilities that threaten Soviet security, Konev continued. Their atomic weapons, demonstrated so dramatically in Japan, represent only the most obvious threat. Their aviation technology provides delivery systems that could reach Moscow from bases in Western Europe. Victor understood he was being recruited for something far more significant than conventional military service. The Soviet Union needed specialists who understood American aviation capabilities from direct experience, men who could evaluate threats and develop countermeasures based on intimate knowledge of enemy systems. The assignment was both honor and curse. Victor would join a classified program tasked with preparing Soviet defenses against potential American air attack. His expertise with American aircraft made him uniquely qualified to anticipate how American pilots would employ their technological advantages against Soviet targets. Over the following months, Victor found himself at the center of a massive intelligence operation. Captured American equipment was systematically analyzed not for reverse engineering purposes, but to understand tactical employment and identify vulnerability. Every American aircraft type was flight tested by Soviet pilots trained to think like their potential enemies. The work revealed disturbing patterns in American military planning. Technical specifications indicated aircraft designed for operations far beyond immediate wartime requirements, range capabilities that exceeded any reasonable European theater needs, payload capacities optimized for strategic bombing rather than tactical support. These weren't weapons designed for the current war, they were tools for the next one. Colonel Robert Hayes, an American intelligence officer who had remained in Berlin as part of joint occupation duties, provided unwitting confirmation of Soviet concerns during supposedly friendly conversations. Hayes spoke casually about American military planning that assumed continued global responsibilities and potential conflicts with former allies. "We learned a lot about strategic bombing during the war," Hayes mentioned during a diplomatic reception. "The techniques we developed against German industry could be applied anywhere that threats to American interests emerge." Victor reported these conversations to his superiors, understanding that every casual comment from American officers was being analyzed for intelligence value. The friendly cooperation of wartime was rapidly transforming into careful observation and assessment of potential threats. The most chilling revelation came through intercepted American communications discussing nuclear weapons integration with conventional bomber forces. American planners weren't treating atomic bombs as unique weapons of last resort, but as standard components of strategic aviation doctrine. The implications suggested American willingness to employ nuclear weapons in conflicts that Soviet leadership might consider conventional. By early 1946, Victor was leading a team of Soviet pilots tasked with developing air defense tactics specifically designed to counter American bomber formations. Using captured B-17s and B-24s, they practiced interception techniques that assumed American bombers would approach Soviet targets with fighter escort and electronic countermeasures. The exercises revealed sobering truths about Soviet defensive capabilities. American bomber formations, protected by escort fighters with superior performance characteristics, could probably penetrate Soviet airspace and attack strategic targets before effective interception could be organized. Soviet fighter aircraft lacked the altitude performance and armament necessary to disrupt massed bomber formations consistently. More troubling still were intelligence reports about American jet aircraft development. While Soviet engineers struggled to reverse engineer German jet technology, Americans were already flight testing advanced designs that promised performance capabilities far beyond anything currently available to Soviet forces. Victor's final report to Marshal Konev painted a picture of strategic vulnerability that would influence Soviet military planning for decades. American aviation capabilities represent an existential threat to Soviet security, he concluded. Their current technological lead, combined with nuclear weapons and global basing rights, creates strategic advantages that conventional responses cannot address. The Marshall's response was immediate and comprehensive. Soviet aviation development would receive unlimited resources and highest priority. Aircraft designers would be given access to captured German scientists and American technology. Most importantly, Soviet strategic doctrine would assume hostile American intentions and prepare accordingly. Victor found himself appointed to a permanent position within the Soviet General Staff, tasked with monitoring American aviation developments and recommending countermeasures. His wartime experiences flying American aircraft had transformed him from combat pilot to strategic analyst, responsible for protecting Soviet airspace against the very aircraft he had once flown in combat. The irony wasn't lost on him. American Lend-Lease aircraft had helped the Soviet Union survive German aggression. But understanding American capabilities had revealed threats that would dominate the next phase of global conflict. The P-51 Mustang that had seemed like salvation in 1943 now represented the prototype for weapons that would deliver nuclear destruction to Soviet cities. Years later, as the Cold War settled into its familiar patterns of tension and competition, Victor would reflect on the moment when everything changed. It wasn't the end of the war that marked the beginning of Soviet-American rivalry. It was the day Soviet pilots first climbed into American cockpits and discovered capabilities that their former allies possessed but rarely discussed. The American fighters had arrived combat-ready, just as the intelligence reports had indicated. But they had also arrived carrying the seeds of future conflicts that would define the remainder of the 20th century. Soviet pilots had learned to fly American aircraft, but more importantly, they had learned to fear what American industry could produce when directed to hostile purposes. Victor's wartime service had ended, but his real war, the long, cold conflict of technological competition and strategic preparation, was just beginning. The American fighters had taught him valuable lessons about aviation, but the most important lesson was about the nature of power in the modern world. Superior technology, abundant resources, and industrial capability would determine the outcome of future conflicts far more than individual courage or tactical skill. The war had ended with Soviet victory, but Victor understood that the peace would be shaped by American advantages that Soviet pilots had discovered firsthand during those crucial months when enemies became allies and allies revealed themselves as potential threats. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.